Is a capital time for boys. What in the world do you mean, I wonder?" He lifted the child onto his knee and stroked his hair as though he were patting the flank of a horse. Jimbo took no notice of the interruption or of the caress, and went on saying what he had to say, though with eyes a little more clouded. "Winter's like going into a long black tunnel, you see. It's downhill to Christmas, of course, then uphill all the way to the summer holidays, but the uphill part's so slow that—" "Tut, tut," laughed the Colonel in spite of himself. "You mustn't have such thoughts. Those are a baby's notion. They're silly, silly, silly."
"Do you really think so, father?" continued the boy, as if politeness demanded some recognition of his father's remarks, but otherwise anxious only to say what was on his mind. "You wouldn't think them silly if you really knew, but of course there's no one to tell you in the stable, so you can't know. You've never seen the funny big people rushing past you and laughing through their long hair when the wind blows so loud. I know several of them almost to speak to, but you only hear wind. And the other things with tiny legs that skate up and down the slippery moonbeams without ever tumbling off, they aren't silly a bit, only they don't like dogs and noise. And I've seen the furniture," he pronounced it furniture, "dancing about in the day nursery when it thought it was alone, and I've heard it talking at night. I know the big cupboard's voice quite well. It's just like a drum, only rougher." The Colonel shook his head and frowned severely, staring hard at his son, but though their eyes met, the boy hardly saw him. Far away at the other end of the tunnel of the months he saw the white summer sunshine lying over gardens full of nodding flowers. Butterflies were flitting across meadows yellow with buttercups, and he saw the fascinating rings upon the lawn where the fairy people held their dances in the moonlight. He heard the wind call to him as it ran along by the hedgerows, and saw the gentle pressure of its swift feet upon the standing hay. Streams were murmuring under shady trees, birds were singing, and there were echoes of sweeter music still that he could not understand, but loved all the more perhaps on that account.
"Yes,"
announced the Colonel later that evening to his wife, spreading his hands out as he spoke.
"Yes, my dear, I have made a discovery, and an alarming one. You know, I'm rarely at fault where the children are concerned, and I've noted all the symptoms with unusual care. James, my dear, is an imaginative boy."
He paused to note the effect of his words, but seeing none, he continued,
"I regret to be obliged to say it, but it's a fact beyond dispute. His head is simply full of things, and he talked to me this evening about tunnels and slippery moonlight till I nearly lost my temper altogether. Now the boy will never make a man unless we take him in hand properly at once. We must get him a governess or something without delay. Just fancy if he grew up into a poet or one of these. In his distress the soldier could only think of horse terms, which did not seem quite the right language. He stuck all together, and kept repeating the favourite gesture with his open hand, staring at his wife over his glasses as he did it. But the mother never argued. "He's very young still," she observed quietly, "and as you have always said, he's not a bit like other boys, remember?" "Exactly what I said. Now that your eyes are open to the actual state of affairs, I'm satisfied."
"We'll get a sensible nursery governess at once," added the mother.
"A practical one?"
"Yes, dear."
"Hard-headed?"
"Yes."
"And well educated?"
"Yes."
"And firm with children? She'll do for the lot then."
"If possible."
"And a young woman who doesn't go in for poetry and dreaming and all that kind of flummery?"
"Of course, dear."
"Capital! I felt sure you would agree with me," he went on. It'd be no end of a pity if Jimbo grew up an ass. At present he hardly knows the difference between a roadster and a racer. He's going into the army too," he added by way of climax, "and you know, my dear, the army would never stand that."
"Never," said the mother quietly, and the conversation came to an end. Meanwhile the subject of these remarks was lying wide awake upstairs in the bed with the yellow iron railing round it. His elder brother was asleep in the opposite corner of the room, snoring peacefully. He could just see the brass knobs of the bedstead as the dying firelight quivered and shone on them. The walls and ceiling were draped in shadows that altered their shapes from time to time as the coals dropped softly into the grate. Gradually the fire sank, and the room darkened. A feeling of delight and awe stole into his heart. Jimbo loved these early hours of the night before sleep came. He felt no fear of the dark. Its mystery thrilled his soul. But he liked the summer dark, with its soft warm silences, better than the chill winter shadows. Presently the firelight sprang up into a brief flame, and then died away altogether with an odd little gulp. He knew the sound well. He often watched the fire out, and now, as he lay in bed, waiting for he knew not what, the moonlight filtered in through the blazed curtains and gradually gave to the room a wholly new character. Jimbo sat up in bed and listened. The house was very still. He slipped into his red dressing-gown and crept noiselessly over to the window. For a moment he paused by his brother's bed to make sure he really was asleep. Then, evidently satisfied, he drew aside a corner of the curtain and peered out. "Oh!" he said, drawing in his breath with delight, and again, "Oh!" It was difficult to understand why the sea of white moonlight that covered the lawn should fill him with such joy, and at the same time bring a lump into his throat. It made him feel as if he were swelling out into something very much greater than the actual limits of his little person, and the sensation was one of mingled pain and delight, too intense for him to feel for very long. The unhappiness passed gradually away, he always noticed, and the happiness merged after a while into a sort of dreamy ecstasy into which he neither thought nor wished very much, but was conscious only of one single unmanageable yearning. The huge cedars on the lawn reared themselves up like giants in silver cloaks, and the horse-chestnut, the umbrella tree as the children called it, loomed with its motionless branches that were frosted and shining. Beyond it, in a blue mist of moonlight and distance, lay the kitchen garden, and he could just make out the line of the high wall where the fruit trees grew. Immediately below him the gravel of the carriage drive sparkled with frost. The bars of the windows were cold to his hands, yet he stood there for a long time with his nose flattened against the pane and his bare feet on the cane chair. He felt both happy and sad. His heart longed dreadfully for something he had not got, something that seemed out of his reach, because he could not name it. No one seemed to believe all the things he knew in quite the same way as he did. His brothers and sisters played up to a certain point, and then put the things aside as if they had only been assumed for the time and were not real. To him they were always real. His father's words, too, that evening had sorely puzzled him when he came to think over them afterwards. "They're a baby's notion. They're silly, silly, silly." Were these things real, or were they not? And as he pondered, yearning dumbly, as only these little souls can yearn, the wistfulness in his heart went out to meet the moonlight in the air. Together they wove a spell that seemed to summon before him a fairy of the night, who whispered an answer into his heart. "We are real so long as you believe in us. It is your imagination that makes us real, and gives us